Sophie Martinez walked along a narrow dirt path just outside her small Texas town, holding her son Mateo's hand as they explored the late afternoon sun. The sky glowed with streaks of burnt orange, creating a gentle warmth that soothed Sophie's anxious heart. She was a 32-year-old mother doing her best to raise her boy alone, determined to protect him at all costs after the painful end of her marriage. Mateo, only 5 years old, seemed drawn to every strange object and curious noise, as though he sensed secrets adults were too busy to notice. That day was no exception. He tugged on Sophie's arm, guiding her toward a rusty container sitting in the distance. Its metal walls were covered in peeling paint and patches of rust, making it look out of place against the rolling fields beyond. "Mommy, there's someone calling," said Mateo, stopping so abruptly that Sophie nearly stumbled. He pointed to the container, eyes wide with concern. Sophie glanced at the old, battered structure. She heard nothing but the wind brushing past tall weeds. Still, she crouched down to face her son. She tried to keep her voice calm, although his words sent a ripple of unease through her chest. "It might just be the wind," she said, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "Are you sure you heard something?" Mateo nodded, his small face serious. "It said, 'Help me, Mommy.'" Sophie hesitated. She trusted her son's instincts, but the container looked abandoned, with no hint of life inside. The afternoon light made the edges of the structure cast long, ominous shadows on the ground, as if warning them to keep away. She led Mateo closer, though not too close, and peered at the metal walls. There was a moment of stillness. The world seemed quiet, the only sound a low rustle of dry grass in the wind. Sophie felt foolish for doubting Mateo, yet she also needed to be sure. Taking a few steps forward, she laid a hand on the container's side. The surface felt cool beneath her fingertips, the paint flaking off in brittle chips. She heard nothing inside, no voice, no scratching. With a reassuring smile meant mostly for herself, Sophie turned back to her son. "It's empty," she said softly. "Maybe you just imagined it." Mateo's gaze dropped to the ground, disappointment flickering in his eyes. He didn't protest, though. He simply followed his mother's lead as they walked home, their quiet footsteps blending with the hush of twilight. That night, Sophie struggled to sleep. She lay on her side in the small bedroom she shared with Mateo, who was already dozing in his bed. The memory of the rusty container kept pulling at her thoughts. Maybe she had missed something. The town wasn't crime-ridden, but who was to say that nothing sinister could happen there? Eventually, she drifted off, slipping into a troubled dream. In that dream, she was back by the container, the sky dark and moonless above her. A single lantern flickered at her feet, casting shaky beams of light over the metal door. Her heart pounded as she heard muffled cries for help. She grabbed the door handle, trying to yank it open, but it was locked. She pounded her fists against the cold steel until they throbbed, shouting for anyone to hear her. Then she saw a trembling hand reaching from beneath the door, pale fingers curling around the edge as if begging for release. The sight jolted her awake, drenched in sweat. The darkness of her bedroom felt suffocating, and she clutched her blanket, her breathing ragged. Sophie turned on the small bedside lamp, its warm glow revealing the gentle rise and fall of Mateo's chest. She found comfort in seeing him peaceful. Still, she couldn't shake the image of that hand from her dream. It had felt disturbingly real, as though someone truly was trapped inside that container, calling out for rescue. Eventually, she forced herself to lie back, determined to dismiss the nightmare as a result of her own anxiety. She reminded herself that life had been difficult enough lately, working morning shifts at a local bakery, caring for Mateo by herself, dealing with whispers about her past marriage. Why add more worry to her mind? But sleep would not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard a faint voice echo in her thoughts. "Help me." When morning arrived, the world outside felt vibrant and safe again. Birds sang, and sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains of her living room. She prepared pancakes for Mateo, hoping the warmth of the kitchen would silence the doubts in her mind. While they ate, she avoided mentioning her dream or the container. Still, something had changed in her boy's demeanor. Mateo's usual bright chatter was replaced by quiet reflection, as though he too sensed something unresolved. Once she dropped him off at the local elementary school, she lingered on the sidewalk longer than usual, feeling an inexplicable tug at her conscience. That afternoon, she stopped by the grocery store, picking up flour and sugar for tomorrow's shift at the bakery. On her way home, she passed a notice board near the entrance, plastered with flyers. One in particular caught her eye, a missing senior. The black and white photo showed a frail woman with sad eyes, though Sophie couldn't quite place where she had seen that face before. She made a mental note of the contact number, then hurried back to her car. As evening fell, Sophie and Mateo sat together on the living room rug, working on a puzzle of cartoon animals. The playful image was meant to calm both of them, but her mind drifted back to the container. She couldn't ignore the dread creeping up her spine, reminding her that her dream had been too vivid to be mere imagination. Mateo set down a puzzle piece with a satisfied grin and looked up at his mother. "Are we going back?" he asked in his small, curious voice. Sophie's chest tightened. She thought about how she had assured him there was nothing to worry about, yet something inside her kept insisting that they had walked away from a real cry for help. "Not tonight," Sophie answered, her tone gentle but uncertain. "We'll see, sweetheart." As bedtime neared, she tucked Mateo in, smoothing down his dark hair with tender fingers. She kissed his forehead, her thoughts swirling with the possibilities of what they might have overlooked. When at last the house fell silent, she settled into her own bed, exhausted from the constant churn of worry. Sleep took her once again, but it offered no peace. In her dreams, she found herself back at the container, the same lantern flickering, the same frantic voice calling out, clearer this time. The words were labored, drenched in desperation. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. She felt nails scraping the inside, the screech of metal on metal. Suddenly, the door in her dream swung open, flooding her vision with a pale glow. A shape, thin, trembling, and barely alive, reached out. The figure's voice, raspy and broken, uttered a single phrase, "Help me." Sophie jolted upright, her heart hammering so loudly that she feared waking Mateo. She stayed there, breathing in shallow gasps, trying to calm the terror that gripped her. The dream felt too real, as though it were a memory or a prophecy rather than a mere nightmare. She sensed that she could no longer dismiss what Mateo had heard. Something was wrong, and no matter how illogical it seemed, she knew the truth. Her son's instincts were rarely misleading. The container was hiding more than just rust and old debris. Someone might be in danger. In the darkness, Sophie made herself a silent promise. She would return to that place, if only to quiet the voice in her mind that refused to let her rest. Before she laid back down, she cast a worried glance at the pale moonlight shining through the window. Then she closed her eyes once more, bracing herself for what she might discover. The hours of the night passed slowly, and when dawn finally broke, she got up feeling determined, despite the lingering chill in her bones. She had no idea that her search for answers would draw her into the path of danger or how far she would have to go to protect the people she loved. But in that moment, as she prepared breakfast and listened to Mateo's soft hum, she could almost hear the echo of a distant voice, whispering through the early morning light. "Help me." Sophie woke from her restless sleep feeling more tired than before. The memory of her dream clung to her thoughts, urging her to find clarity. She moved through her morning routine in a daze, filling Mateo's lunchbox and making sure he had everything he needed for school. Her hands were steady, but her heart pounded at the idea of confronting whatever lay inside that rusted container. Once she walked Mateo to his classroom, she lingered in the hallway, watching other parents and children greet one another. It was a typical scene filled with light-hearted chatter, but Sophie felt detached from it all, as though she stood on the edge of an invisible boundary that no one else could see. She had to know if something or someone was truly trapped in that container. After leaving the school, she decided to stop by her home and grab a flashlight. The day was bright, but she wanted to be prepared. She also felt a strange pull to speak with her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who often sat on her porch watching the comings and goings of the neighborhood. Sure enough, Mrs. Henderson was there, perched in her usual rocking chair. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her weathered hands held a glass of iced tea. She waved at Sophie with a warm smile that quickly turned to concern when she noticed the worry etched on Sophie's face. "Morning, dear," said Mrs. Henderson, setting down her glass. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sophie tried to force a polite smile, but failed. She walked up the short driveway and leaned against the wooden railing. "I need to ask you something, and it might sound strange. Have you heard anything about a container near the old junkyard on the edge of town?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "A container? You mean that old shipping crate left by the field? I've heard rumors. Some folks say it's abandoned, but others claim they've seen lights out there at night." She paused, her voice growing softer. "There have also been whispers of missing people, especially a few older folks who vanished without much explanation." A chill ran down Sophie's spine. She clasped her hands together, trying to steady her nerves. "Has anyone actually been reported missing?" Mrs. Henderson shrugged, a gesture tinged with sadness. "In a small town like ours, sometimes people just slip away, especially seniors with no close family. It's heartbreaking, really." Sophie felt a jolt of alarm. She remembered the missing persons flyer she'd seen at the store, though she hadn't made the connection until now. Her mind began to race. She thanked Mrs. Henderson, who reached out and gently patted Sophie's arm. "Be careful," the older woman said, her voice low, as though sharing a secret. "Not everyone in this town is as they seem. And if you've got a suspicion, trust it. Sometimes that's all you have." Determined to get answers, Sophie hurried to her car, feeling the weight of Mrs. Henderson's words. She drove toward the outskirts of town, passing the quiet roads that led to the old junkyard. As she approached, she noticed how still the area was, the silence broken only by distant bird song. It felt like the kind of place where secrets could remain hidden indefinitely. The container stood exactly where she remembered it, bathed in the harsh midday sun. She parked her car on a patch of uneven dirt and walked over, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and urgency. When she reached the container, she circled it slowly, taking in every detail. Rust covered the metal walls in sprawling patches, and the padlock on the door looked thick with age. She ran her fingertips over the surface, feeling jagged edges of corroded metal. Then she noticed something she hadn't seen before, faint scratches trailing along the outside near the door. They were arranged in uneven patterns, as though someone had desperately clawed at the metal from within. Her chest tightened. She took out her flashlight, even though the afternoon light was still strong, and tried to shine it through a small gap where the door met the wall. Dust motes danced in the beam, but she couldn't see anything beyond the first few inches of darkness. Then she felt a dull thump against the metal, so soft she almost missed it. She froze, pressing her ear to the surface. A second thump followed, weak and uneven, like someone was trying to get her attention. "Hello?" Sophie called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone in there?" She listened intently, waiting for a response. For a moment, she thought she heard a feeble moan, more vibration than sound, and her stomach flipped. Desperation gripped her. She rattled the padlock, realizing she had no tools to break it open. Her mind spun with frantic thoughts, but she forced herself to remain calm. She stepped back, breathing heavily. Someone was definitely inside, and they might be in terrible trouble, but she couldn't force the door without something sturdy like a crowbar. She also couldn't just stand there doing nothing. Sophie pulled out her phone, considering whether to call the police right away. Then she remembered how small-town rumors spread. What if the police dismissed her claims, or worse, accused her of trespassing on private property? She was still determined to do the right thing, but the caution in her mind reminded her to gather more than just a gut feeling. Resolute, she called 911 anyway, explaining in a clear, urgent tone that she believed someone was trapped inside a container near the junkyard. The dispatcher's questions made her stumble. She couldn't confirm any missing person or provide solid evidence, just her intuition. The dispatcher said they would send an officer to check it out, but Sophie sensed a polite skepticism in the woman's voice. As she waited by her car, scanning the road for any sign of a patrol vehicle, an uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She thought about her conversation with Mrs. Henderson, the missing persons flyer, and the faint cries Mateo claimed to have heard. Everything pointed to a dire situation, yet she felt powerless to act alone. Minutes ticked by and no one arrived. Sophie's impatience grew, and she decided to at least look around for any sign of footprints or tire tracks. Behind the container, she found a scattering of half-buried beer cans and scraps of metal, but nothing indicating recent activity. When another 15 minutes passed with no sign of help, Sophie realized she might have to take matters into her own hands. She shot one last glance at the container, feeling a sense of dread that she tried to push aside. She needed better tools and perhaps the cover of night to find out what was truly happening. As she drove away, a single image haunted her mind. Those scratches near the door, deep and ragged, telling a story of panic and fear that words could not. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the deserted land, as though hiding the darkest secrets beyond the reach of daylight. Sophie spent the rest of the day on edge, unable to focus on her tasks at the bakery. The hum of the industrial mixer and the sweet smell of rising dough usually calmed her, but not this time. Each time she glanced at the clock, her heart constricted, knowing the container was still out there, holding a secret she could not ignore. She kept checking her phone, wondering if the police had gone to investigate. No calls came. When her shift finally ended, she hurried to pick up Mateo from school. He was sitting on a low wall outside the building, kicking his feet and gazing off into the distance. As soon as he spotted her, his expression brightened, but Sophie noticed a hint of concern in his eyes. "Are we going back?" he asked, his voice carrying an innocence that broke her heart. She brushed a hand over his hair. "Not yet," she answered quietly, "but soon." She could not bear the thought of waiting much longer. The idea of someone being trapped and possibly hurt was more than she could stomach. After dinner, once Mateo was in bed, she found herself unable to sleep. Memories of her dream kept returning, accompanied by the real image of those scratches on the container's wall. Close to midnight, she slipped out of her home. The air was cool, and the streets were mostly empty, with only a few porch lights glowing in the distance. She drove with the windows cracked open, trying to steady her nerves. Her breath felt tight in her chest, and every passing shadow made her flinch. Upon arriving at the container, she parked far enough away to avoid drawing attention from the road. She stepped out, clutching a flashlight and a small crowbar she had borrowed from a friend who kept tools in his garage. The moon was high, its pale light turning the open field into a patchwork of silver and black. Standing before the container, Sophie felt the heaviness of an unseen presence. She could sense desperation in the air, as though the metal walls themselves were alive with silent pleas for help. With trembling fingers, she moved to the door, shining her flashlight over the rusted padlock. She pried at it with the crowbar, straining with all her strength. At first, it refused to budge, the metal resisting her efforts. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she continued, her arms shaking. Finally, the lock gave a loud snap and the door jerked open an inch. A foul, suffocating odor emerged, one that made Sophie stagger back and cover her mouth. The smell was stale and tinged with something that hinted at decay, a sharp reminder of what she might find inside. The urge to run seized her for a moment, but she remembered Mateo's insistence and the thought of a life hanging in the balance. She forced the door wider and swept her flashlight around. The interior was cramped and dark, littered with torn pieces of cardboard and scattered debris. Her beam fell on the corner, where she caught sight of a frail figure curled up against the wall. Pale hair clung to a scalp marked by bruises, and the person's clothes were tattered beyond recognition. "Ma'am," Sophie called out, her voice shaking, "can you hear me?" The figure stirred. A pair of hollow eyes looked up, glistening in the dim light. Sophie stepped closer, swallowing hard as the odor intensified. She knelt down, carefully touching the woman's shoulder. She felt thin bones beneath her hands, the woman's skin cold and clammy. "It's okay," Sophie said, her own heart pounding. "I'm going to help you." The woman's lips parted in a trembling breath. She tried to speak, but only a raspy whisper came out. Sophie pressed an ear closer, hearing fragments of words. Betrayal. Left behind, no one came. The anguish in that broken voice nearly overwhelmed Sophie. She set the flashlight on the ground, quickly dialing 911. Her hands shook so badly that it took 2 tries to press the right buttons. This time, there was no doubt in her mind that this was a genuine emergency. The dispatcher's voice asked questions, and Sophie answered as best she could, describing the woman's condition and urging them to send help immediately. When the call ended, Sophie returned to the woman's side, noticing her shallow breathing. "My name is Sophie," she said, keeping her tone gentle. "You're safe now. An ambulance is on the way." The woman raised a trembling hand, her fingers like brittle twigs. She clutched Sophie's wrist with surprising strength, her eyes wild with fear. Her voice cracked as she managed to utter a single sentence. "They locked me in here. My own family." The implication struck Sophie like a blow. She had assumed it might have been a random criminal act or the work of someone dangerous. The thought that this poor soul had been left to die by her own relatives made Sophie's stomach twist with rage. She stayed by the woman's side, stroking her hair, whispering words of comfort. In those long, agonizing minutes before the ambulance arrived, Sophie felt a shift deep within her. She realized her life was about to change in ways she could not have foreseen. Someone had committed an unspeakable cruelty, and if they were willing to do this to an elderly family member, they would stop at nothing to protect their secret. At last, flashing lights cast flickering red and blue hues over the empty field. The paramedics hurried into the container, gently lifting the woman onto a stretcher. Sophie followed them outside, gulping down fresh air, her pulse thundering. When one of the paramedics asked if she knew the victim's identity, Sophie could only shake her head. All she knew was that the woman's frail lips had parted just before she collapsed, whispering words that sent a chill through Sophie's entire body. "They're watching! They're always watching!" Sophie stood there, clutching her phone and the crowbar, watching as the ambulance doors closed. She could hear the sirens wail, cutting through the stillness as the vehicle sped away. In that moment, she knew her discovery was only the beginning of a far darker truth. Her thoughts turned to Mateo, to the memory of his voice urging her to listen. He had known something was wrong long before she did. She felt both gratitude and fear. A few hours ago, she was simply a concerned mother following a gut feeling. Now she had plunged headfirst into a nightmare. She looked up at the moonlit sky, a chill wind rustling the dry grass around her. The realization weighed on her. Whoever had done this would not want their secret exposed, and that meant the danger was only just beginning. Sophie stood in her dimly lit living room, the faint glow of a table lamp outlining her silhouette against the drawn curtains. Only a few hours had passed since she found the elderly woman locked inside that oppressive container, yet it felt like a lifetime. Her mind replayed the trembling voice, whispering, "They're watching. They're always watching," a haunting echo that refused to fade. Mateo was asleep in his bedroom, and the house seemed unnaturally quiet. Sophie stared down at her phone, half expecting a call that would tell her the woman was going to be fine, or that she had passed away in the ambulance. When no such call came, she decided she could no longer wait. Clutching her car keys, she slipped on her jacket and hurried outside. The chill of the night air hit her cheeks, and she pulled the collar tighter around her neck. Anxiety churned in her stomach, but a sense of determination fueled her steps. She drove through the mostly deserted streets, guided by the steady glow of streetlights. The hospital stood near the edge of town, a stark building with bright windows cutting through the darkness. Inside, fluorescent lights bathed the corridors in a sterile glow. Sophie found a receptionist who directed her to the emergency ward. Her heart pounded as she navigated the hallways, scanning each room number. Finally, she spotted a nurse stepping out of one of the rooms, carrying a tray of medical supplies. "Excuse me," Sophie said softly, approaching. "I'm looking for the elderly woman who was brought in tonight. She was found inside a container. The nurse's expression shifted from professional detachment to concern. "Are you family?" Sophie shook her head. "I'm the one who found her. I just needed to know if she's okay." The nurse hesitated, then glanced at the room behind her. "She's stable, but we're monitoring her closely. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, signs of possible trauma." She paused, lowering her voice. "She's not fully coherent, but she did mention a name. Maggie Dawson." Sophie felt her chest tighten at finally having a name for the woman she had rescued. Maggie. Somehow, the knowledge made the situation all the more real. "Can I see her?" "Briefly," said the nurse, stepping aside. "But please understand she needs rest. The police might have some questions for you as well." Sophie nodded, slipping into the room. It was small and sterile, typical of a critical care space. Machines beeped softly and an IV drip fed fluids into Maggie's thin arm. Wires attached to her chest recorded every heartbeat and breath. Her face appeared hollow, cheeks sunken from neglect, but there was a certain resolve in the way her brow furrowed, even in sleep. Sophie approached quietly, her breath catching in her throat when she realized just how frail the woman looked, without the shadows of the container. The nurse had said Maggie was stable, but seeing her up close, Sophie could hardly believe it. She gently touched Maggie's hand, fighting back tears she could not fully explain. From behind, a presence stirred, and Sophie turned to see a tall man standing in the doorway, a badge clipped to his belt. He had dark hair streaked with early hints of gray, and his posture suggested the kind of calm authority that comes from years on the job. "Detective Ryan Collins," he introduced himself, voice low to avoid disturbing the patient. "I'm told you're the person who found Miss Dawson." Sophie nodded, stepping away from Maggie's bedside. "Yes, I'm Sophie Martinez." He studied her face, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Mind if we talk?" She agreed, and together they moved into the hallway where the muted hum of hospital life surrounded them. Detective Collins asked her to recount everything. How she first heard about the container from her son's insistence, the moment she broke the lock, and what Maggie had said. "I know it sounds unbelievable," Sophie admitted, wringing her hands, "but it's the truth. She was trapped in there, and from the looks of it, not just for a day or two." Collins scribbled notes in a small pad. "So you have no idea who might have done this?" Sophie hesitated, recalling Maggie's ominous words about family. "No, not personally, but Maggie mentioned something about betrayal, that her own family put her there." She swallowed hard, wishing she had more concrete details. "I'm sorry, that's all I know." He snapped the notebook shut, offering a tight nod. "We'll run a background check to see if Miss Dawson has any next of kin, maybe a son or a daughter. In the meantime, I need you to stay reachable. If anything else comes to mind, any detail, let me know." Sophie agreed, feeling a wave of relief that someone was taking this seriously. But as the detective walked away, a new kind of dread took root. She had no idea who else might be lurking, intent on silencing Maggie's story. When she returned home, the house was still silent, and the clock on the kitchen wall showed nearly 3 in the morning. In her bedroom, she found Mateo curled up in a deep sleep, his small form barely visible beneath the blankets. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, exhaustion bearing down on her, yet sleep would offer no comfort. Not when a storm of questions whirled in her mind. She barely drifted off before the alarm for her morning shift at the bakery buzzed. With a groan, she dragged herself out of bed, splashed cold water on her face, and forced down a cup of strong coffee. Work felt surreal that day. She kneaded dough and decorated pastries almost mechanically, haunted by the image of Maggie's thin hand and the detective's pointed questions. During her lunch break, Sophie checked her phone. No calls from Detective Collins. She bit her lip, wondering if they had found any leads. She decided to visit the hospital again that evening, hoping to see if Maggie was awake enough to provide more clarity. Before leaving work, she quickly arranged for Mrs. Henderson to watch Mateo, grateful for the neighbor's kindness. Sophie arrived at the hospital to discover Maggie had been moved to a quieter ward. There, among the hushed rooms and drawn curtains, Sophie found her sitting upright in bed, eyes half open. A thin stream of sunlight cut across the gray wall, illuminating Maggie's weary expression. "How are you feeling?" Sophie asked softly, pulling a chair closer. Maggie turned her gaze, recognition flickering in her eyes. She parted her cracked lips and croaked, "Thank you for finding me." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. "Do you remember what happened?" Maggie's frail hands trembled against the blanket. She blinked slowly, as if piecing together stray fragments of memory. "My son and his wife. They took what was mine, then left me there." Her voice grew brittle with anger and heartbreak. "They told me if I made any noise, nobody would believe me anyway." A flush of rage warmed Sophie's cheeks. She struggled to keep her voice calm. "Do you know where they might be now?" Maggie shook her head, eyes clouded with fear. "But they'll be watching," she murmured. "They always are." Sophie leaned forward, gently holding the older woman's hand. "They won't get away with this," she said, her voice quivering with resolve. "I promise." Yet even as she spoke, Sophie felt uncertainty creep into her heart. This wasn't just a random crime. This was a dark betrayal by family, the kind of sin people would go to great lengths to hide. She remembered the scratched walls of the container and the hateful finality of that locked door. Whoever put Maggie there had every intention of leaving her to die, unnoticed and alone. Sophie stayed until Maggie drifted into a fitful sleep, then quietly left the hospital. As she walked down the corridor, her pulse quickened at the thought of someone watching her every move. She tried to shake off the paranoia, but the sensation clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. Before stepping outside, she paused near the reception desk. Detective Collins stood there, speaking to a doctor in hushed tones. He caught her eye and offered a subtle nod. Sophie felt a spark of hope. At least the authorities were involved now. But with that hope came a deep realization. Maggie's ordeal was only the beginning of a much larger battle for justice. Sophie left the hospital with her head held high, determined not to let fear control her. She had no way of knowing what lay ahead, but one thought burned brightly in her mind. She would protect Maggie, just as she protected Mateo. No matter the cost, no matter the danger, she could not turn her back on someone who had no one else. Exhaustion weighed on Sophie like a lead blanket, but she forced herself to push through her day. After dropping Mateo off at school, she gathered enough courage to head back to the hospital, a box of pastries from the bakery in her hands. She hoped a small act of kindness might lift Maggie's spirits, maybe even coax out more details about the people who had done this to her. At the nurse's station, Sophie was informed that Maggie was awake, but still too weak for long conversations. Her vitals were improving, the nurse said, but psychologically, she remained fragile. Sophie entered the room, noticing how still it felt. Maggie lay with her eyes closed, mouth parted slightly, as if straining to hear each footstep. At the sound of Sophie approaching, she opened her eyes, revealing a flicker of relief. "You came back," Maggie murmured, voice quivering. Sophie set the pastry box on a small side table, then eased into the chair beside her. She gently reached for Maggie's hand, careful not to startle her. "I wanted to see how you're feeling." Maggie attempted a faint smile. "Better now that I'm out of that place." She swallowed hard, her gaze drifting toward the window as though fearful of what might lurk beyond. "They put me there after taking my house. I have nothing left. No one to go to." Sophie clenched her fists, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "We'll find out who did this," she said, trying to reassure them both. "The police have your name and will be investigating." As if on cue, Detective Ryan Collins stepped into the room. He glanced at Sophie and gave her a nod of acknowledgement before focusing on Maggie. "Miss Dawson, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need more information about your son and daughter-in-law. Could you give me their full names?" Maggie exhaled a shaky breath, eyes darting between the detective and Sophie. "Peter Dawson and Linda. Their last name is also Dawson," she added with a hint of confusion, as if not quite believing they had married. "Peter is my only child." A thick silence fell over the room, and Sophie noticed the detective's jaw tighten. He made a quick note. "Do you have any idea where they might be now?" Maggie hesitated, her face twisting with emotional pain. They live in my house now. The last time I was conscious there, Linda was packing up my belongings. She told me I wouldn't be needing them anymore." Her voice caught in her throat, tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. "She said I was too much trouble." Sophie's heart pounded as she listened, imagining the cruelty it took to lock an elderly woman in a container and leave her to die. She could hardly believe such a thing could happen in a quiet Texas town where everyone seemed to know each other. Detective Collins cast Maggie a compassionate glance. "We'll pay them a visit, Miss Dawson, I promise you that." He then turned to Sophie. "Miss Martinez, a moment in private?" They stepped into the hallway where the distant sound of hospital machinery formed an uneasy soundtrack. The detective's expression was more grave than before. "I'm going to investigate Peter and Linda Dawson, but be careful, Sophie. If what Maggie says is true, these people are dangerous. I'd recommend you keep your distance." A shudder ran through Sophie as she remembered the frantic warning Maggie had given. "They're watching. They always are." She nodded, though she knew in her heart she couldn't simply turn a blind eye. "I understand." Collins thanked her and left, shoes clicking briskly against the tiled floor. Alone again, Sophie gazed through the small window in the door, watching as Maggie's frail form seemed to shrink into the sheets. The older woman had no one else now, and Sophie couldn't help but feel responsible. She owed it to Maggie and to her own conscience to make sure this never happened again. Back in the room, Sophie kept her voice soft. "The detective will do everything he can," she said, "but if you remember anything else, papers you signed, conversations you overheard, please tell me." Maggie nodded, her thoughts drifting to the day Linda forced her to sign documents, claiming it was for financial convenience. The memory made her shiver. "They tricked me, made me sign away my house and assets." She rubbed her eyes, trying to hide fresh tears. "I never thought my own family would do this. She stopped short as the door opened again. This time it was a nurse coming to change an IV drip. Sensing Maggie's exhaustion, Sophie decided it was time to let her rest. She gave Maggie a comforting squeeze on the arm, then gathered her things to leave. The drive home felt surreal. Sophie navigated the roads on autopilot, her thoughts tangled in a swirl of disbelief and fury. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she noticed Mrs. Henderson sitting on her front porch, keeping an eye on Mateo. The neighbor smiled in greeting, but Sophie could see the question in her eyes. Sophie walked over, lowering her voice so Mateo wouldn't hear. "Her name is Maggie Dawson," she explained, crossing her arms to ward off a sudden chill. "Her own son and daughter-in-law did this to her. I can't even begin to understand how someone could be that cruel." Mrs. Henderson shook her head in dismay. "I've seen families fight over property and money before, but never like this." She paused, then added gently, "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Sophie thanked her, then took Mateo inside, feeling an overwhelming urge to hold him close. She found him in the living room, surrounded by crayons and paper. He looked up with a smile that held the pure innocence she desperately wanted to protect. "Hi, Mommy," he said, pushing his little drawing toward her. "It's a picture of you helping that lady. Are you going to help her more?" His question struck her with surprising force. She knelt down and gathered him into a hug, pressing her cheek against his soft hair. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "I am." In that moment, Sophie realized there was no turning back. Even with Detective Collins involved, the sense of dread she had felt earlier lingered, as if someone was out there waiting, poised to strike. She would not abandon Maggie Dawson. Her heart simply wouldn't allow it. That night, she faced another round of uneasy dreams. Images of locked doors, stolen papers, and Linda's face flashed in her mind, twisted with malice. Over and over, she heard a soft, rasping voice in the darkness. "They're watching. They always are." She woke in a cold sweat, the weight of Maggie's predicament pressing on her chest. Somewhere in this town, the people who did this unspeakable act walked free, And if they discovered that Maggie was still alive, they might do anything, to keep their secrets safe. Sophie's days became a blur of work and worry. She continued her early morning shifts at the bakery, kneading dough and decorating pastries while her thoughts spun with fear for Maggie. Between tasks, she'd check her phone repeatedly, half expecting updates from the detective or the hospital. One late afternoon, as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown number, and Sophie felt a pang of anxiety before answering. "Miss Martinez," came Detective Collins's voice. "We've located Peter and Linda Dawson." Sophie clutched the phone tighter. "Are they in custody?" A pause. "Not yet," he replied. "We spoke to them briefly. They claim Maggie's mentally unstable and wandered off on her own. They said they've been searching for her. There's more. Apparently, they're showing paperwork stating they're her legal guardians." Heat flared in Sophie's cheeks. "That's not true. They locked her up to die in that container." Collins's tone remained measured. "We'll need solid evidence to prove that, Miss Martinez. I'm doing everything I can, but the documents they provided muddy the waters. Without clearer proof or Maggie's coherent testimony that contradicts their story, we can't just arrest them." Sophie steadied her trembling hand. "But you know what happened. You've seen her condition." He let out a weary sigh. "Yes, and I'm not going to drop this. I'm calling because I'd like you to come to the station to give a detailed statement. The sooner the better." They arranged a time for the next day. Sophie ended the call, her thoughts racing. If Peter and Linda were free, what was stopping them from trying to silence Maggie for good? She finished up at the bakery, worry gnawing at her like a persistent ache. Before heading home, she drove to the hospital, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. When she reached Maggie's room, she found it empty. Alarm shot through her until a passing nurse noticed her expression and quickly explained that Maggie had been moved to a semi-private ward for patients on the road to recovery. Relief washed over Sophie like a cool wave. She followed the directions to the new room and found Maggie sitting up in bed, flipping through a hospital menu with mild curiosity. "Oh, thank goodness," Sophie breathed, stepping inside. "I was worried when I didn't see you in your old room." Maggie offered a tired smile. "The nurses say I'm improving. My body still feels weak, but my mind's clearer every day." Sophie approached her bedside, casting a glance around the quiet room. She wondered if Peter or Linda had tried to visit. "I need to tell you something, Maggie. The police spoke to your son. He's denying everything, saying you're confused." A flash of anger darkened Maggie's eyes. "He's the one who's confused, thinking he can get away with murder." She inhaled a shaky breath, then clutched Sophie's hand as if drawing courage from her presence. "I'm not as strong as I used to be, but I'll do whatever it takes to expose the truth." Sophie nodded. "I'm heading to the police station tomorrow to give a full statement. Detective Collins is trying to help, but he needs more concrete evidence." Maggie closed her eyes as though recalling a painful memory. "The day they locked me up, Linda had me sign something. She said it was a power of attorney to manage my finances. She was so insistent. I didn't realize until it was too late." That could be crucial," Sophie said, swallowing hard. "If we can show that you were coerced, maybe we can prove they meant to steal your assets." Maggie nodded, her grip on Sophie's hand loosening as fatigue set in. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "They took my house, my money, and tried to take my life. I won't let them get away with it." That night, Sophie parked outside her modest home, noticing only then how quiet the streets were. For a moment, she simply sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding with a blend of anger and resolve. She refused to let fear paralyze her. Inside, she found Mateo busily coloring at the kitchen table, Mrs. Henderson sitting nearby with a watchful eye. When Sophie entered, the neighbor stood, offering a kindly smile. "All's well here," Mrs. Henderson said. "How about you?" Sophie swallowed the knot in her throat. "I'm going to the station tomorrow. They've talked to Peter and Linda. They're lying." A flicker of concern passed over Mrs. Henderson's face. "Be cautious, dear. Some people will do anything to protect their secrets." Sophie saw herself reflected in the older woman's worried eyes, and she mustered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you for looking after Mateo." Once Mrs. Henderson left, Sophie wrapped her arms around her son. She felt his warmth against her and breathed in the simple reassurance that came from holding him close. "Mommy, are you sad?" he asked, his voice soft. She closed her eyes, fighting back the fatigue that tugged at her soul. "A little, but I'm also trying to make things right." He tilted his head, studying her face. "You always help people, Mommy. I know you'll help her." His unwavering faith filled her eyes with tears. She kissed his forehead and promised herself she would not fail Maggie. That promise stayed with her through another restless night, haunted by thoughts of Linda's manipulative smile and Peter's cold intent. She had to be strong, for Maggie's sake and for Mateo's. Early the next morning, Sophie dressed in simple jeans and a neat blouse, determination shining in her gaze. She dropped Mateo at school, then drove to the police station, nerves fluttering in her stomach. The building was an unassuming structure of faded bricks, with a flagpole out front swaying in the gentle breeze. Detective Collins met her in the lobby. He guided her to an interview room with gray walls and a single table. The harsh, overhead light seemed to magnify every anxious thought in her mind. Taking a seat across from him, Sophie recounted every memory she had, every detail of Maggie's condition, every word the older woman had spoken. Collins recorded the statement, occasionally prompting her with questions. "Could you describe the container in more detail? How exactly did you break the lock? Did Maggie mention any specific threats before you called the ambulance?" Sophie answered them all, her voice firm despite the anxiety thrumming in her chest. When she was done, the detective switched off the recorder and looked at her steadily. "Thank you. I know this isn't easy." She nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. "I just want her safe, and I want them to pay for what they did." He steepled his fingers, choosing his next words carefully. "Look, there's a chance Peter and Linda may try to discredit both you and Maggie. They might say you're seeking attention, or that Maggie's memory is failing. If things escalate, they might even come after you. Maybe not physically, but legally. You should be prepared." Sophie's chest felt tight, recalling how quickly rumors could spread in a small town. She raised her chin, resolve shining in her eyes. "I won't let them scare me." Yet beneath her bravado, fear coiled in her gut. As she stepped back into the sunshine outside the station, she realized the battle had only just begun. Despite the tension mounting around her, Sophie attempted to keep a sense of normalcy in her daily routine. Each morning, she woke early to prepare Mateo's breakfast, then hurried to the bakery for her shift. Yet behind her measured smiles for the customers lay a constant worry. She had begun receiving odd phone calls at strange hours, numbers she didn't recognize. Whenever she answered, the other end was silent, then abruptly disconnected. She tried telling herself it might just be telemarketers or wrong numbers, but the unease in her chest said otherwise. One afternoon, a few days after her police interview, she finished her shift and stepped outside into the bright Texas sun, only to notice a black sedan parked across the street. The moment she glanced its way, the car's engine started, and it pulled away. Her heart thumped loudly. Could it have been Linda or Peter or someone they had hired? That evening, she sat on her small front porch, sipping tea and keeping an eye on the street, half expecting that black sedan to appear again. Mrs. Henderson dropped by, drawn by Sophie's tense posture. "Are you all right, dear?" the older woman asked gently, resting a supportive hand on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie tried for a reassuring smile, but failed. "I'm just jumpy. I keep thinking someone's watching the house." Mrs. Henderson's face creased with concern. "We're with you, Sophie. Don't forget, there's more good in this town than bad." Her words were comforting, but they did little to chase away the shadows gnawing at Sophie's peace of mind. After dinner, she tried to relax by drawing with Mateo. The boy laughed at her silly attempts to sketch cartoon animals. But every time a car passed outside, Sophie's head whipped toward the window, expecting trouble. That night, well after Mateo had gone to bed, Sophie found herself wide awake, scrolling through news articles on her phone. Stories of elder abuse and financial scams filled her screen. She clicked on one headline after another, seeing patterns that match Maggie's situation all too well. Relatives taking advantage, forging documents, discarding elderly family members. It was horrifying and yet tragically common. Her phone buzzed, causing her to nearly drop it in alarm. The screen displayed an unknown number. Heart pounding, Sophie debated whether to answer. Slowly, she pressed the button to accept the call. At first, silence. Then a voice she recognized all too well, soft and condescending. "Miss Martinez, is it?" Sophie's stomach twisted. "Who is this?" "I believe we've never met," the woman said, her voice dripping with calculated calm. "But you know my husband, Peter. I'm Linda Dawson." Sophie's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles whitened. She forced herself to remain calm, though her heart hammered. "What do you want?" A short laugh echoed through the line. "You've meddled in a private family matter. Now you're causing quite a stir, spreading ridiculous accusations. I'm calling to offer you a chance to stop." Sophie's cheeks burned with anger. "A chance to stop?" she repeated. "You left Maggie to die. You think I'm just going to pretend none of this ever happened?" Silence followed for a moment, then Linda's voice hardened. "Listen carefully. Maggie is old, confused, and in poor health. Nobody is going to believe your little story once we show them how unstable she is. So if you know what's good for you, you'll drop this crusade of yours." Sophie inhaled sharply, rage bursting through her fear. "If you come near Maggie again, I'll make sure you pay for it." Linda let out a quiet chuckle that made Sophie's skin crawl. "You already broke into our property, didn't you? The container belongs to us, actually. What's to stop us from pressing charges against you for trespassing? You see, Miss Martinez, there's more than one way to ruin your life." Before Sophie could respond, the call ended with a click. She sat there, heart racing, the dial tone humming in her ear. Adrenaline surged through her veins, followed by a wave of nausea. She pressed her hand to her mouth, realizing she was trembling uncontrollably. She set the phone aside and tried to steady her breathing. Linda's words confirmed what she already knew. These were dangerous people, willing to twist the truth to protect themselves. The threat of legal action, of turning her heroism into a criminal act, was horrifyingly real. Sophie ran a hand through her hair, fighting the urge to cry from sheer frustration and fear. Thoughts spiraled through her mind. What if Linda managed to paint Sophie as a reckless trespasser who broke into private property? What if she stirred up enough doubt that the police decided not to pursue charges against them? Worse, what if they tried to hurt Mateo? She forced herself to think logically. Detective Collins was on her side at least, and Maggie's testimony, once she was strong enough to articulate the details, would go a long way in establishing the truth. Still, Sophie needed to be prepared for Linda's manipulations. The next day, she went about her routine, nerves on edge. She picked up Mateo from school, constantly scanning the surroundings. Mrs. Henderson noticed the tension in her posture and offered encouraging words, but Sophie's unease refused to fade. Later that evening, after tucking Mateo into bed, she found a sealed envelope pushed through her mail slot. Curious and afraid, she opened it to discover a typed note on plain paper. No signature, no sender's address. "Stay silent or we'll make you regret ever getting involved." Sophie's lungs tightened, her hand clutching the note so tightly that it crumpled around the edges. The message was clear. Linda and Peter were escalating their threats. She stood in the dim hallway, her heart thundering, face set in grim resolve. She was terrified, but this time she refused to let terror immobilize her. The image of Maggie's frail figure, left to die in a rusted container, burned in her memory. And she thought of Mateo, whose gentle faith in her was unwavering. No, she wouldn't bow to intimidation. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she carefully placed the note in a drawer. She would show it to Detective Collins, add it to the growing list of reasons why Peter and Linda needed to face justice. Then, bolstering her courage, Sophie grabbed her phone and made a promise to herself, whispering into the quiet, "I'm not backing down." Somewhere outside, the night felt alive with unseen eyes, just as Maggie had warned. But Sophie refused to hide. She checked on Mateo, ensuring he was safe in his bed, then locked every door and window. If Linda and Peter thought they could scare her into silence, they were gravely mistaken. She would fight back, not just for Maggie, but for the peace and safety of her own little family. And so, in the stillness of that Texas night, Sophie Martinez stood her ground, uncertain of what tomorrow might bring, but unwavering in her resolve to uncover the truth and protect those who had no one else to turn to. Sophie stared at the note she had received. The blunt warning to stay silent gnawed at her. Each passing moment felt like stepping across thin ice, never sure when it might shatter beneath her. She carefully placed the threatening letter in an envelope, along with her own written account of Linda's ominous phone call. The next morning, she went straight to the police station. Detective Ryan Collins met her in a small interview room, the same one where she had given her initial statement. He thumbed through the envelope's contents, his expression grim. "This is serious," he said, setting the note on the table. "It backs up your account of being threatened. We can at least open a line of investigation for harassment." Sophie let out a shaky breath. Peter and Linda won't stop. They've already tried to paint Maggie as delusional, and now they're targeting me. Collins nodded. "I'll talk to them again, but let me offer you some advice. Watch your back and don't do anything that could be twisted against you." She left the station feeling a surge of anger. How was she supposed to protect Maggie if Linda and Peter could manipulate the law? Sophie decided to check on Maggie at the hospital once more before heading to work. When she arrived, she discovered Maggie sitting up in bed, her back propped against a pillow. Although still pale, she appeared more alert than ever before. Maggie's eyes lit up at Sophie's arrival, but that brightness dimmed when she noticed Sophie's anxious expression. "They sent you a warning, didn't they?" Maggie asked, voice wavering with quiet dread. Sophie nodded. "They're trying to scare me, to make me give up." She reached for Maggie's hand. "But I'm not going anywhere. Detective Collins is doing what he can, and soon we'll have enough to put them away." A flicker of hope crossed Maggie's face, quickly followed by worry. "They're more cunning than you realize. Peter used to be so sweet when he was young, but Linda changed him. Or maybe he was always like this, and I never saw it. Just be careful, Sophie." Sophie promised she would. That afternoon, she managed to push through her bakery shift, though her mind remained elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about how to prove Peter and Linda's guilt. The following day, she received a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "I have information about Peter and Linda Dawson. Meet me at the corner of Oak and Willow at 8 p.m. Come alone." Alarm bells rang in Sophie's head. It could be a trap, or a lead that might finally expose the Dawsons' crimes. She weighed her options, thinking of Maggie, remembering how close the older woman had come to death. If there was even the slightest chance this tip was genuine, Sophie felt compelled to check it out. So that evening, just before sunset, she left Mateo in Mrs. Henderson's care, slipped out of the house, and drove to the specified location. Oak and Willow intersected near an abandoned storefront, a lonely stretch of sidewalk where the flicker of a damaged streetlight cast jittery shadows. Sophie parked a block away and walked cautiously. The air was still, carrying the faint smell of dust and old concrete. She glanced at her phone. 7:58 p.m. Right on time. A man in a baseball cap emerged from a dim corner, hands jammed into his jacket pockets. He looked around nervously, then approached Sophie. She tensed, ready to run if needed, but he only held up a slip of paper. "You're the one who helped that old lady, right?" He spoke in a hushed tone, his voice trembling. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding. "Do you know something about Peter and Linda?" He shifted on his feet. "I used to do odd jobs for them. A while back, they hired me to deliver some boxes and furniture to that container near the junkyard. I saw them load a bed frame, old blankets, even some of the old lady's clothes." Sophie's stomach twisted. Linda and Peter had prepared that container as more than just a dumping ground. It was a makeshift cell. They told me not to ask questions, the man continued, voice lower, but I saw them lock the door from the outside. I heard the old lady screaming. I tried to tell the cops once, but Peter's got connections in town, and Linda threatened me if I talked. He thrust the slip of paper at her. This is a phone recording I made. It's on a USB drive. Their conversation, it proves everything. A surge of hope cut through Sophie's fear. Why give it to me? He managed a sad smile. You're the only one who seems to care. Maybe you can do something. Before Sophie could say another word, the man ducked into the shadows and disappeared, leaving her alone, clutching the slip of paper. Her hands trembled. She had to get this to Detective Collins immediately. She turned to hurry back to her car, but no sooner had she taken a few steps than an engine roared to life. Headlights flared, blinding her. A dark SUV lurched from an alley, tires screeching against the asphalt. Sophie dove to the side, her heart pounding as the vehicle sped off into the night. Shaken, she ran to her car, locked the doors, and drove straight to the police station. The USB drive contained a single audio file. She played it back with Detective Collins listening beside her. Fuzzy voices grew clearer until she recognized Linda's unmistakable hiss. Lock her in and let her rot. She's not leaving that container alive. We'll say she wandered off. Nobody will believe her if she shows up. Collins's mouth set in a grim line. This is it, he said. A direct admission of intent. With Maggie's statement, we'll have enough to move against them. Relief coursed through Sophie, yet fear lingered. Linda and Peter would not surrender easily, and if the SUV that nearly ran her down had been their doing, they might try something worse once they learned she had the recording. Collins called for backup. The plan was to confront Peter and Linda the next morning. Sophie wanted to be there, but the detective advised her strongly to stay away for her own safety. Sophie reluctantly agreed, though she couldn't stop her heart from hammering with both excitement and dread. Late that night, she returned home to find Mrs. Henderson waiting anxiously on the porch. Sophie quickly reassured her that she was unhurt. Then she slipped into her house to check on Mateo, who was sound asleep. Sitting on his bedside, she watched him breathe and felt an overwhelming rush of love and protectiveness. Clutching the USB drive in her hand, she understood that tomorrow might finally bring justice for Maggie, but it could also provoke a dangerous backlash from the Dawsons. Either way, there was no turning back now. Morning light filtered through Sophie's curtains, rousing her from a restless sleep. She got dressed, fed Mateo, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but her stomach churned, anticipating the confrontation Detective Collins had planned. She stood by the window, sipping coffee, her eyes fixed on the street outside. Finally, she heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. It was happening. A mix of apprehension and triumph swelled in her chest. Although Collins had instructed her not to appear at Maggie's house, she found herself unable to stay away. She needed to see this through. Dropping Mateo off with Mrs. Henderson, she drove across town toward Maggie's property. Once Maggie's, at least. The gate was flung wide open and an unmarked police car sat in the driveway. A patrol car idled by the curb, lights flashing. Sophie parked down the street, her heart pounding. Cautiously approaching on foot, she saw Detective Collins standing in the yard with two uniformed officers. They faced Peter Dawson, a tall man with a facade of respectability undone by the furious glint in his eyes. Beside him stood Linda, lips pulled into a tight line, her posture rigid with indignation. Maggie was not visible. Sophie guessed she was still in the hospital or safely elsewhere. She inched closer, just in time to hear Collins read from the arrest warrant, detailing charges of elder abuse, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Linda's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "This is ridiculous," Linda snapped, stepping closer to Collins. "I want to see your supervisor. We did nothing wrong." Peter clenched his fists, looking at the uniformed officer reaching for his handcuffs. "Are you insane? Do you know who I am? My mother was sick. She needed special care. We gave up our lives to look after her." Collins held up a USB drive. "Then perhaps you can explain why you said on this recording, 'Lock her in, let her rot.'" A flicker of panic darted across Linda's face. Sophie saw the moment Linda realized that their carefully spun lies were unraveling. She shot a look at Peter, who looked away as though he could not bear the sight of her desperation. Sophie remained hidden behind a low hedge, her heart thrumming at the spectacle. Justice was so close she could almost taste it. An officer approached Linda with handcuffs. Linda slapped the cuffs away, her voice rising in fury. "How dare you! I'm calling my lawyer!" With a practiced calm, the officer secured her wrists. Another officer did the same to Peter, who sputtered indignantly, yanking his arms in protest. They were both led toward the waiting patrol car. Suddenly, Linda locked eyes with Sophie. She jerked away from the officer, lunging a step closer. "You," Linda snarled, voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over? You have no idea what we're capable of." Sophie's breath caught, but she stood her ground. She refused to let fear claim her. Even though her hands trembled, she raised her chin, letting Linda's threat roll off her. Detective Collins stepped forward, placing himself between Sophie and the furious woman. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Miss Dawson, you're under arrest. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Linda spat on the ground, eyes brimming with hatred, as the officer shoved her into the patrol car. Peter followed close behind, quieter but seething with a resentful glare. The doors slammed shut. Only then did Sophie step out from behind the hedge, her heart still hammering. She met Collins's gaze with a tremulous smile. He tilted his head in a silent acknowledgement, as if to say, "You shouldn't have come, but I understand why you did." The sirens flared to life, and the police cars disappeared down the street, leaving the yard eerily quiet. Sophie stood there, air rushing in and out of her lungs, feeling the weight of it all lift from her shoulders. The fear that had been her constant companion began to ebb. Maggie would finally have a chance to heal in peace, and the people who wronged her would face the consequences of their actions. Collins approached, giving Sophie a measured look. "Brave of you to show up here," he said in a gentle admonishment. She let out a shaky laugh. "I had to see it through." He tucked the USB drive into an evidence bag. "We've got them. They won't walk away from this, not with everything you've uncovered. Maggie's testimony, the container, the recording, it's a strong case." Sophie nodded, relief washing over her like a cool breeze on a scorching day. For the first time in weeks, hope shone clearly in her mind. She drove home, the roads passing in a blur. When she arrived, she found Mateo eagerly waiting with Mrs. Henderson. The boy ran to her, hugging her legs, and she lifted him up, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "It's over, Mommy?" he asked, wide-eyed. Sophie held him close. "Almost, baby, but we're safe now." As dusk fell, Sophie finally allowed herself a moment of respite, curling up on the living room couch with her son. Tomorrow they would visit Maggie in the hospital and let her know that she was free from Linda and Peter's shadow. That single thought brought tears to Sophie's eyes. Tears of gratitude that, in a world capable of such cruelty, compassion and truth could still prevail. Days slipped into weeks. Peter and Linda were held in custody, their case winding through the legal system. Detective Collins kept Sophie updated, and it seemed the evidence was overwhelming. Maggie had recorded her own statement describing every detail of her imprisonment. Coupled with the audio file and Sophie's testimony, the case against the Dawsons looked ironclad. Maggie was transferred to a rehabilitation center to regain her strength. She started physical therapy sessions, fighting to overcome the damage done by her time in the container. The quiet determination in her eyes gave Sophie hope. Maggie might never forget the betrayal that nearly took her life, but she was proving each day that she refused to be a victim. One afternoon, Sophie visited Maggie at the rehab facility. Bright sunlight poured through large windows, and the clean scent of antiseptic mingled with the pleasant aroma of fresh flowers set on side tables. Sophie found Maggie in a small therapy room, carefully rising from a chair, guided by a physical therapist. "Sophie," Maggie said, beaming as soon as she saw her, "I can't tell you how good it feels to walk on my own again." Sophie returned the smile. "You look stronger every day, Maggie. Keep going. You're doing great." As the therapist finished the session, Sophie helped Maggie back to her room, where Mateo waited with a homemade card. The boy proudly presented it, and Maggie's eyes glistened with tears. "It's beautiful," she said, tracing a finger over his scribbled hearts and stick figure drawings of all three of them together. "Thank you, Mateo." The boy grinned. "My mom says you're coming home soon." Maggie cast Sophie a questioning glance. "I'm not sure where home is now," she said softly. "The house belongs to me by law, or at least it should, but I don't feel safe there anymore. Too many memories, too much paperwork to sort out." Sophie squeezed Maggie's hand. "I've been thinking, if you want, you could stay with Mateo and me for a while. I mean, until you decide what you want to do next. Our house is small, but we'd make space." Maggie blinked, momentarily stunned by the offer. Then a look of deep gratitude settled on her face. "You'd do that for me?" Sophie's chest tightened with emotion. "You saved yourself, Maggie. All I did was listen to my son's instincts and open a door. But if you need a place, somewhere safe where people care about you, our home is open." Tears slipped down Maggie's cheeks, and Sophie gently brushed them away. They both understood it would take time to heal, but for the first time, Maggie looked at peace. A week later, the day came for Maggie's release from the rehab facility. Detective Collins arranged for a security escort, just in case Linda or Peter had associates lurking. But the handoff went smoothly. Maggie, leaning on a cane for support, walked through Sophie's front door as Mateo bounded around, excited to show off her new bedroom. "It's not fancy," Mateo announced, pointing at the freshly made bed and the floral curtains Sophie had hung. "But it's home." Maggie's eyes sparkled. "Yes," she said, sinking onto the bed with a sigh of contentment. "Home." Over the following days, an air of relief settled into the house. Maggie spent her mornings doing simple stretches recommended by her therapist, while Sophie left for her bakery job. Mateo continued school, proudly telling his friends that Maggie lived with them now. In the evenings, they shared dinner around a small wooden table, forging a sense of family that transcended blood ties. Sometimes, Maggie woke in the night from nightmares, memories of the container and the cold betrayal echoing through her dreams. Sophie would sit with her, hand in hand, until the tremors eased. Other times, Sophie felt her own surge of fear, her mind flashing back to Linda's threats or the menacing vehicle that nearly ran her down. But in those moments, she looked around and saw the gentle strength in Maggie's eyes, the comforting presence of Mateo's laughter, and knew they were no longer alone. Weeks turned into a month, and the day of the pre-trial hearing arrived. Sophie accompanied Maggie to the courthouse, where they both testified. Linda and Peter sat across the aisle, each with separate attorneys, but their arguments felt hollow against the mounting evidence. Maggie's hands shook at first, but her voice grew steady as she recounted her ordeal. The judge listened intently, and by the end of the hearing, it was clear the Dawsons' defense was crumbling under the weight of their lies. A sense of vindication filled Sophie's heart. She remembered the very first day she and Mateo saw the container, how she almost dismissed his insistence that someone was inside. Had she ignored him, Maggie might have died in solitude. That night, they returned to the small house they now called home. A calm hush enveloped the rooms. Maggie settled into a chair by the window, sipping tea and staring out at the star-splashed sky. Sophie joined her, feeling a gentle tranquility in the air. Maggie spoke softly, breaking the silence. "Thank you, Sophie, for everything. You gave me back my life." Sophie offered a tender smile. "Mateo and I, we're just glad you're here, Maggie." They sat together in companionable quiet, each lost in thoughts of the ordeal they had weathered. Outside, a soft Texas breeze rustled through the neighborhood, the night peaceful and full of unspoken promise. In time, Maggie might reclaim her house, or sell it, or start fresh somewhere else. But for now, she found comfort under Sophie's roof, where she felt wanted and respected. And Sophie, who had once feared she might fail as a mother, took pride in how fiercely she had protected someone in need. Mateo's voice drifted from the hallway, calling them to come look at a new picture he had drawn. Maggie and Sophie exchanged warm glances, then rose to join him. Their steps felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of secrets. In that moment, they all understood the true meaning of family, caring for each other, standing up for what was right, and never turning away when someone called for help. As they gathered around the child's drawing, laughter filled the small home. Shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer held the power to terrify. Together they had forged a new bond, one built on compassion, trust, and the shared determination that no life, young or old, should ever be abandoned in the dark.